Welcome to the Unpacked Project.
We're your hosts. I'm Noelle.
And I'm Miranda.
We're here to explore all things social justice. It's through casual conversations, interviews, and storytelling that we hope to inspire others to take action towards a more compassionate and equitable world.
Because honestly, it kind of sucks here sometimes.
For real, we can do better, people.
All right, let's start unpacking. Hey, Noelle.
Hi, Miranda.
Hey, everybody. So we are back with our final episode this season. And really, we've covered a lot from extremism and the alt-right, white nationalism and white Christian identity, and the role social media has played in spreading false information to peace building and how we combat hate at the community level. We've covered a lot, like I said, in just 8 short weeks. And while vastly different from season 1, we've continued to build upon the whys and the hows of structural racism in America and the ways that it continues to inform and influence lives differently.
Yeah, I mean, this season really taught us the importance of understanding those varied nuances between extremist groups, information that better tells us how to engage in counterterrorism work to dismantle these entities. So we talked about mainstream media, the need for, Lisa, mentioned the Fairness Doctrine to end opinion-based journalism, fake news, so many things that are affecting society right now. And, then we talked to Damon, the role of Christianity has played within white nationalism. And then most importantly, just kind of exploring within these narratives that communities can band together to fight hate. The systemic racism, bigotry, like really at a local level, just trying to empower communities to know that we can do this together. So, it's really a hope that we hold for all communities one day. That's part of why we're doing this podcast. So I think it was great that we ended with Patrice, that she really had that message after we did so much learning this season.
Yeah. And I mean, and it was so easy just listening to her. She's such a storyteller. And I think, we kind of ended, we tried to infuse that into season 1 as well, like these actionable steps, which I kind of talked about in that interview with Patrice as well. And like you said, really it's that hope amongst others that drives us to do this work every day. We work to dismantle white supremacy through education, dialogue, and providing actionable steps towards an anti-racist and really an equitable world. But we also can't continue to do this without support from our community, right? We talk about that often. Next season, we're moving towards a no season kind of vibe, where we can just really focus more on current issues. That's something that I know we've talked about getting into. It'll also give us the ability to go live more often and really just talk about current issues, cover more information within racial and social justice, and most important to us, build our equity, diversity, and inclusion trainings. So as we continue to grow, Noelle and I ask if at any point you've appreciated our podcast, the content, the interviews, or simply if you just want to show us love, that you donate through our Venmo, which is at The Unpacked Project, or you click the link in our Instagram bio at the Unpacked Project. So that'd be super helpful as we continue this work. So thank you.
No one would believe how many times we've re-recorded our intro over the
The_Unpacked Project. Damn it, it's wrong again. Shit. Like, you can't, once I remember something wrong, that's it,
I know. And then we continue making the mistakes. So
right. Just like shit.
No, but yeah, I mean, the need for, more education and resources is really important, especially the world that we're living in today, honestly reflects that. People are out there and consuming all of this information on social media and in the news, and it's like, how do you navigate these really important things that are happening? With another mass shooting that happened in Indianapolis, we have the murders of Dante Wright, Adam Toledo, like all in this week. There's just been so much that's happening. It's so overwhelming, and just on the heels of everything right now, really needing to get facts out there, resources out there, showing people like what we can do, just show up and just be a part of doing this work. So, I can't help but go back to the stats that we shared in the beginning of Lisa's interview from her article, QAnon and Mass Digital Radicalization, Peace Building in the American Insurgency. I'm going to actually read them again because I think that it's just important for us to reflect on them again. So according to a Reuters poll, 13% of the U.S. population supported the siege at the Capitol. And I think also just kind of thinking about this kind of juxtaposition to all these arguments of our black and brown people that are being shot and killed for not complying, or these ridiculous arguments that people,
Yep.
try to justify
Yeah.
these horrific things that are happening.
Yeah. Well, and
And
as
then
a
we
side
have,
note, oh, sorry, I read yesterday, I think yesterday was the 100th day since the siege, right? And so it's like, how far have we come since then? Or really, how many steps have we taken backwards, you know?
no, well, that's what I feel
Yeah.
like it is. I'm just like, I mean, we know these things have been happening, right? But I'm just like, every day I wake up and I'm like, what is
For
going
real.
on? Like, this
Yeah.
just feels
Yeah.
like, it's just so overwhelming. So that one. So, and then the other one, as of September 2020, nearly 60% of Republicans reportedly believed in QAnon, including newly elected members of Congress. In August, the Wall Street Journal reported that the first 5 months of the COVID-19 pandemic saw a 600% increase in membership in the 10 largest QAnon Facebook groups. And I also just think of like what you just posted about how many hate
Yep.
groups exist right now. And while it might be decreasing, just like how much is going on out there in terms of hateful movements, and even what Patrice mentioned about how the underreporting is going on for hate crimes.
Yeah.
Like we don't even, what we see is not even this much of
Happen.
it,
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's,
Well, yeah. And I had been reading that I think, because they're going through the trials right now for the Capitol attack, and what they're finding is actually a lot of the folks that they arrested and have been charged are like from cities that typically voted for Biden. And
yeah.
so we think of these like metropolitan areas that are more diverse, cultured, kind of open or liberal, or at least skewing liberal. And, it's like it's everywhere, right? Like someone had just responded to that post you just talked about and was like, even in California, there's hate groups. Like, I'm so surprised. And there's a ton in the Bay Area. It's like one of the most liberal places in the country. Like, it's everywhere. Hate is everywhere, and it's infused in everything that we do our lives completely. And I think just people really need to understand the severity of it and how deep it runs.
Yeah. Well, and if we're not doing this work, one of our episodes was just kind of like hiding in plain sight, right? Like
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
groups that exist that are out there, that are either like blending, or we're just not paying attention, and they're getting these passes with what's happening. And I think the more we can empower communities to kind of be more sensitive and more aware of what's happening, then hopefully we can start making the change. I know that's a lot of what we're here for, right?
Yeah.
These are a lot of the reasons why we're doing this work. And I'm just reminded of something that we discussed with Damon actually recently. It really hit home for me, the need to really start shifting how we have these conversations
Yeah.
about extremism, and the need to start paying more attention to how just like regular ass people with these kind of, these white nationalist beliefs get the privilege of being ignored
Yep.
because they're maybe not out there storming the Capitol or blowing up buildings. And so I just remember talking about this I think it was the beginning of the season, and I said that like white people sort of detach from this sort of thing. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, if I'm not in the KKK, I'm not racist. Like I'm not that bad. And Damon really mentioned how these extremist groups can distract us,
Yeah.
from that everyday racism that exists. He talked about these colonial beliefs, right,
Yeah.
that people walk around with that are extremely damaging and obviously systemically oppressive.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I was
and
like,
go ahead.
yes,
Yeah.
like I
Yeah.
remember him saying it's just
Yeah.
like I'm done with white people getting passes, and I'm
Yeah.
done with us kind of, even if you're not partaking in some of the overt racism that's
Yeah.
happening. I've said this in many episodes before, but I feel like if you're silent, you're complicit. Like it's just,
Yes.
if we're
Yes.
not standing up to it, you're a part of it. And I could think back to when I literally got goosebumps when Damon was discussing how he would reimagine doing this work, and he started off by saying that we all need to start with listening, which
Yeah.
I mean I value, obviously, as like a
Yeah.
psychologist, right? Like a
Yeah.
part of my
Yeah.
job is listening, but I think it's really important to like tune in to what's being said and the
Yeah.
content of what people are saying on both sides, like not
Yes.
just
I mean,
when I
yes.
agree with it, yeah, but on all sides of it. So let's just practice listening, and let's take a listen back to what he said.
I think it starts with listening, listening to those people who are most affected by the history of racism, the way that racism's been institutionalized, and the rhetorics that normalized those racist practices in our institutions and render them invisible to people who don't feel their effects. So, for example, I was in a discussion about diversity training, and I was struck that you had people being polled saying this is something that we need in our institution, and then directly somebody who is a part of the institution saying, I really need you to hear me when I talk about these things, that this is needed. And I was struck about how little impact that seemed to have because some in the institution maybe had a different perspective, which is totally fine. But I think, it's an ethical question, and I get this from Judith Butler's giving an account of oneself, that the fundamental ethical question is not what you're comfortable with in the sense of like, what can I do, but what you're willing to risk. The big ethical question is, are you willing to risk all the things that you thought were being unraveled and engaging with the need of someone who's saying, I'm hurting and I need help?
So, when I listen to that, I'm just like, this is why I'm doing this. Like, I felt like he summarized so well and eloquently, like what I've always kind of thought, especially for white people. Like what are you willing to risk? What are you willing to challenge and stand up for? When you hear and you really listen, especially like I said, thinking of this week, right? And all these things, I mean, we talk about George Floyd, but there's just so many instances of this violence. And like, what don't people get? Like, I don't get what we're still having this conversation about. It just blows my mind, and it just makes me want to do this work even more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's like, as I always say, we write our scripts, right? So I'm in here reading your notes, and I'm like, oh my God, just the fact that people don't get it, right? Like it drives me crazy to my core, and especially there's been so much right now with like school districts and schools pushing back on like critical race theory
Yep.
and like anti-racism being taught in schools. And so I definitely share your sentiment. It's like, even on Instagram, right? In needing to listen to both sides, we follow folks from the other side, right? And it's like, what are the conversations that they're having? What are the political views that they have? What do they care about? Because really it's not just this right and left, right? It's a continuum, it's a spectrum,
Right.
and people fall all across it, right? And so I think it's important, like you said, really to listen to the other side. And so so many of our interviews really have, and it's funny that you kind of said that, so many of our interviews really have touched on listening. It's been like a theme I've kind of realized between season 1 and season 2. So Patrice, she just talked about it in our last episode from Not in Our Town. She mentions racism and bigotry being a public health issue and that the harm is understudied. And so when we get it out in the open in our communities, when we make a place and we say not in our town, that we stand for safe, inclusive communities, when we begin that process of building a set of shared values in our town, then you start taking these steps, right? And you really start listening to people about what that means, what's unsafe for people, what are the places that are unsafe, what does that look like, right? Because oftentimes we just don't know. I recall back to our first episode with Dr. Williams. Hey, Ashley. And so she spoke of listening to early educators if we're wanting to learn what actually works best for our young children. And then Dr. Brutus, she mentioned giving voice to and listening to immigrant families to find out what their hurdles, like what hurdles schools are putting in place. Not necessarily intentionally, but just because there's a language barrier, they just don't know, right? And so giving people voice and listening, right? It all boils down to that. And so like for me, that's why it's so important to continue this work because we have something really, we have something important to say. And I think a lot of people have been very receptive to that and they know that they need to be listening. So back kind of related, but back to the Damon quote, we often talk about, okay, so all these things we're listening, but then what are we doing, right? And so we come across education resources daily, we learn, and then what, right? So for us in many ways, our then what is this podcast and then moving into equity, diversity, and inclusion training development. But, what are some other things you're doing differently because of what you've learned this season?
I think there's been a few things for me. I've said this before, but I was just so surprised to learn about the nuances between all of the extremist and far right groups. We talk about bias and understanding kind of our own that we have. And that's definitely one of mine. Like, I'm like, all these far right people are Nazis. Like, that's it. Like, there's one,
Goodbye. Shut the door.
category of
Yeah.
all these
Conversation
people,
over.
and they fit right in there. And that's what I think of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. Like, I remember Mark's interview was our first one. And I remember just sitting there being like, oh man, well, like, you have a lot to learn,
Yeah.
And I'm always seeking to learn. I'm always seeking to understand so that we can better address these issues, because I don't want to be out there being ignorant too, right? Like, we need to practice what we preach. And even though it doesn't make any of it right, like, those are values I don't agree with. Like, we're out here trying to shift from, and like Damon said, like, let's not just talk about extremism in the way that we traditionally do, right? But I mean, those are values and ideologies like I'm clearly don't get down with, but I still
Yeah.
need to understand them. And I
True.
still need to be able to connect to the facts and understand where they're coming from, because none of this work is going to go anywhere if we're not trying to, like, see the big picture.
Yeah.
Even when I think of, I think it was the Dante murder, and people started posting about the history of the town, and that, the racism that, I mean, we know racism is embedded with the police everywhere, right? But people started posting about the town and the history of the town, and just like understanding how these things are cultivated and where all of these different groups are at in their thinking. Because then I think it helps us kind of do that work of not necessarily finding common ground, because I think I'm way past that at this point. I think there's
Yeah.
there's just some
Yeah.
people, like, we are not going to be able to find common ground, right? But in terms of kind of challenging some of these things and understanding where the barriers are so that we could be strategic and what our work is, and just understanding how we can address it. So that is definitely one piece just reflectively for me.
Yeah.
Like, I remember literally sitting in Mark's interview like, Noelle, you need to look, you just got caught, like,
Read. You gotta read.
biased
Yeah.
thinking,
Yeah.
right? So that was one. Definitely has expanded my research this season. We talked about how extremism wasn't in our wheelhouse really, like, at all.
Yeah.
Season 1, we were more confident. We're in the education field. We've done restorative practice work. Like, there was a lot of things that we felt comfortable with. But this season wasn't so much of that. And then we learned so much through our interviews that we had, and just different recommendations we had. I've just gone down, like, rabbit holes of different content and materials. And all just the various intersections of the work: white nationalism, Christianity, peace building and community work. One of the recommendations that Damon had, I wound up buying the book, which I'm still waiting on from Amazon, but about
They've been taking longer though. Like, I'm like, what happened to 2-day Prime that I paid for? Why are you telling me it's going to be 4 days?
know, 'cause I
Also,
know what Amazon-
I don't want to admit, but I also don't want to admit that I'm still using Amazon.
yeah.
So, like, we just told on ourselves. Damn it, Noelle.
listen, it was to buy this book, okay?
I know. Edit it out. Edit it out.
But no, it was about, like, how Black Christianity and how they struggle with God and justice and all of these things. So just, like, a lot of research that's come.
Yeah.
And then the other piece for me is just really trying to get out into the community more. We've talked about this between us, like, really wanting to make those connections. It was part of what we did the book drive with, and it's just a value that we have, wanting to get out into the community and do this work. But to quote Patrice, she's like, local is where it's at. And, top-down change should obviously be mandatory for these issues. It sends a message for our government. Like Patrice said, it sort of frames it, right? And there's, like, a firm stance on just issues of humanity. But we can't wait for that as a community. I think the more of us that band together and empower one another to stand up to hate and oppression and racism, the more likely that we will make societal progress. So I was like, well, who wants to start? And not in our town group. I'm like texting Miranda, like, do you want to start this group? I looked it up there. The closest one is Newport Richie. Like, we need.
Okay, I was going to ask you. I'm like, isn't it?
So who's with me? I mean, come on, we need to do this. I told you I want my sign. Put it out.
Oh my gosh, I think you can just order one
I
without
can,
starting a
and
group.
I'm gonna put it out and just maybe see what happens. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So, for those listening, Noelle like has 18 billion ideas, and I'm like, slow down, slow down. Like, we're going to a no season kind of vibe so we can like refocus. She's like, let's do this and let's do this and let's start another town group. But, all jokes aside, and in all fairness, I think I told you when I went onto their website to just look through it, I was like, I would like to start a group here like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it speaks to me, right? And I think a lot of the work that we've done with youth and just like justice within like classrooms and equity in education, like, and building community, that really means a lot to me, So yeah, I do think that Tampa Bay is due for one. And really, we've spoken as well. We've heard way too many questionable things here. I mean, like, it's not,
Yeah.
it's not California, New York.
Well, no, and I feel like that's like where this I mean, obviously came out of George Floyd, right? But when we think about just transplants being here in Florida, I mean, I think we were both appalled at like things in our daily lives that we were
Yeah.
hearing. And it's just hard to make sense of. Like
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's
Yeah.
a lot
Well,
of
and
why we're
interestingly,
here. And maybe if you were in California, I mean, obviously we wouldn't know each other, but like regardless, like when we lived in places where we had more of the same mindset with people,
Yeah.
you kind of take it for granted. And you're here in
Oh.
a place like this, and you're like, wait, like,
Yeah.
everyone time out.
Yeah, everyone,
Yeah.
okay? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
So,
So I don't know. I mean, I do admittedly feel compelled to get involved in politics, like at a community level. So who knows? You might be
Miranda
onto
for
something.
city council.
No, God, no! I can't. Look, I get so nervous just when we start our podcast. I'm like, don't stumble over your words. So I'm like, there's no way I can get
back
up in
with
front
your
of somebody.
cue cards, like during your speech.
Shut up. I'm like, I can't see. I'm getting so nervous. Look, but I guess we'll see what's in store for us during our not so season. So
Yeah, and our message for season 2 was that we were really trying to call people in rather than call people out. And I thought that it was so timely that on our last interview with Patrice, she mentioned how can we push and pull at the same time, which really spoke to me in terms of our goals, needing to get information out there, push people to expand their minds, learn new perspectives. Maybe we start doing work in the community and also start pushing some of the power sources, to really become change agents with us. Also just in order to do this work, you have to be able to pull in too, right? Like we're
true.
pushing people out of their comfort zones, but you have to be able to also pull in. So how can we foster empathy, understanding, how can we build connections together so that we can become more inclusive and more equitable communities for everybody?
Yeah.
So I'm really excited for what we're headed into. I don't, Miranda and I, like on these breaks, she says I have a lot of ideas, but I'm sorry, I get like the 2 a.m. text messages of all your ideas that you
it
have.
was like 11:30, maybe 12:30. Okay.
Well, depending on the night, yeah.
So what about this? What about this? But you're right.
So, I'm excited to see where that goes. And, I think a big struggle of ours was always like having all this content that we wanted to talk about, but then there's all these current events going on and we want to be able to address it all. So I'm really excited for where that's going to go and us being able to connect more with our audience and our listeners, and just kind of continue to do this work and continue learning together. So
Yeah. So thank you all so much for joining us for our last episode of season 2. Catch us on Instagram and we'll see you soon.
And don't forget YouTube. It's new this season.
Oh, yes.
All right. Bye, everyone. See you later.
Bye.
Show the Unpack Project some love and be sure to like, subscribe, and review our podcast. You can also check us out on Instagram at _Unpack Project.
And if you enjoyed today's episode, visit our website at theunpackedproject.com, where you can make a donation that supports the research, production, and operating costs of this work.
Shout out to all of our listeners who unpacked with us today.
See you next week.
Peace.